There's a sentence that will make some people in your life deeply uncomfortable the moment you say it out loud, and it's this. Sometimes the most spiritually evolved, psychologically healthy thing a person can do is walk away from their own family. Not out of hatred, not out of drama, but out of a level of self-awareness most people never reach, because we've been taught from the moment we're born that blood is an automatic, non-negotiable bond, regardless of what that blood actually does to us. Today we're talking about why that idea, as comforting as it sounds, is one of the most quietly damaging myths in human psychology, and why choosing distance from family, when it's done consciously rather than reactively, isn't a failure of love. It's often the single clearest sign that a person has finally grown past a wound most people spend their entire lives unconsciously repeating. Let's start with the myth itself, because you cannot understand why distancing is sometimes the healthiest option without first understanding why so many people never even consider it as a possibility. From early childhood, most of us absorb an unspoken rule that goes something like this. Family loyalty is the highest moral value, above almost everything else, including your own well-being. Family comes first. Blood is thicker than water. You only get one mother, one father, one set of siblings. Protect that bond at all costs, even when the cost is your own nervous system, your own sense of safety, your own basic right to be treated with respect. This rule made a certain kind of evolutionary sense thousands of years ago, when survival genuinely depended on tribal cohesion, when being cast out of your family unit could mean literal death. But we are not living in that world anymore, and yet the wiring remains, deeply embedded, almost sacred, passed down generation after generation without anyone stopping to ask whether it still serves the people carrying it. Here's what almost nobody examines closely enough. Loyalty to a family system was never actually designed to protect the individual. It was designed to protect the system itself, its stability, its continuity, its ability to function as a unit, even when that unit was actively harming one or more of the people inside it. And this is exactly why families that contain real dysfunction, chronic criticism, favoritism, emotional neglect, manipulation, outright abuse, so often produce one particular kind of member, the person who starts to notice, usually much later than they should have, that something about the system itself was never actually safe, no matter how loudly everyone insisted it was normal. Let's talk about what actually happens, psychologically, inside a person who begins to consider distancing themselves from their family, because the process is rarely sudden, and it's almost never as simple as, "They were mean to me once, so I left." It usually starts with a long period of what psychologists sometimes call role compliance. The years, sometimes decades, spent playing whatever part the family system assigned you. The peacekeeper, the scapegoat, the golden child expected to perform achievement in exchange for love, the invisible one who learned early that needing anything at all was inconvenient to everyone else's comfort. These roles get assigned early, usually before a child has any capacity to consent to them, and they get reinforced so consistently that most people don't even recognize them as roles. They just experience them as identity. I've always been the responsible one. I've always been the one who holds everyone together. Not questioning why that responsibility landed on a child in the first place. Distancing begins, almost always, at the exact moment someone starts to notice the gap between the role they've been playing and the person they actually are underneath it. And this noticing is uncomfortable in a way that's hard to overstate, because it requires looking directly at something most people spend their whole lives avoiding: the possibility that the people who were supposed to protect you were, in some real and specific ways, also the people who hurt you the most. Not necessarily through one dramatic event, but through years of smaller moments that, individually, seemed almost forgivable, but collectively added up to a pattern of harm nobody in the family was ever willing to name. This is where the real psychological work begins, and it's far more complicated than the simplified version people often see online. Just cut off toxic family, protect your peace. That advice isn't wrong exactly, but it skips over the actual internal process required to get there safely, honestly, and sustainably, rather than reactively. The first stage of this process is almost always disbelief, directed inward rather than outward. Before someone can distance themselves from a harmful family dynamic, they usually have to survive an extended period of doubting their own perception of what happened. Was it really that bad? Other people have it so much worse. Maybe I'm remembering this wrong. This stage exists because family systems, especially dysfunctional ones, are remarkably effective at instilling a specific kind of confusion in the people raised inside them. A confusion where normal, healthy anger at mistreatment gets rerouted into guilt, self-doubt, and an exhausting compulsion to justify the very people who hurt you. The second stage is grief, and this is the stage most people underestimate entirely, because they assume distancing from a harmful family should feel like relief, like finally escaping something. And there is relief, eventually. But before the relief arrives, there's almost always a profound grief, because what's actually being grieved isn't just the relationship as it currently exists. It's the relationship that was supposed to exist and never did. The parent who was supposed to protect you and didn't. The sibling who was supposed to be an ally and instead became another source of comparison and competition. The family that was supposed to be a safe harbor and instead became something you had to survive and eventually evolve past. This grief is one of the most misunderstood parts of the entire process, because from the outside, it often looks like it should have already happened or shouldn't be happening at all. Why are you still upset? You're the one who left. But grieving the family you needed and never had is not something that resolves the moment you create distance. In many ways, the distance is what finally makes the grief possible, because as long as you're still embedded in the daily performance of the relationship, there's rarely enough emotional safety to actually feel the full weight of what you lost. The third stage, and the one that eventually leads to actual evolution rather than just escape, is the slow, difficult work of building an identity that doesn't depend on the family's approval to feel real. This is the piece that separates reactive estrangement, leaving in anger, in a single explosive moment without ever processing what actually happened, from evolved distancing, which is quieter, more deliberate, and far more stable over time. Reactive estrangement often gets undone, repeatedly, in cycles, because the underlying need for the family's validation never actually got resolved. It just got temporarily numbed by distance and anger. Evolved distancing looks different. It's the result of someone genuinely arriving at a place where their sense of worth no longer requires that specific group of people to see them clearly, to apologize, to finally understand, because that need, the one that used to keep them endlessly hopeful, endlessly trying, endlessly available for one more chance at repair, has finally, gently been released. And here's the part I think matters most, the part that explains why this entire process deserves to be called evolution rather than simply avoidance or coldness. Choosing distance from a harmful family system requires a level of psychological maturity that most people, frankly, never develop, because most people never have to. It requires being able to hold two contradictory truths at the same time without collapsing into either extreme. I love these people, and they were also genuinely harmful to me. Most cultural narratives don't leave room for that complexity. They want a clean story. Either the family was purely loving and you're ungrateful for leaving, or the family was purely monstrous and you're a victim who escaped. Real families and real estrangement almost never fit either of those templates. Real evolved distancing requires sitting inside the uncomfortable middle, love and harm coexisting in the same people at the same time, without either one canceling the other out. This is exactly why this decision is so rare, and exactly why the people who make it, thoughtfully, slowly, without cruelty, without needing the family to suffer in return, are demonstrating something far more advanced than most conversations about toxic family ever give them credit for. It's not about revenge. It's not about punishment. It's about finally, after years of unconscious compliance, choosing your own nervous system's safety over a bond that was assigned to you before you ever had the capacity to evaluate whether it deserved your loyalty in the first place. And in the next part of this conversation, I want to walk you through exactly what this evolved distancing actually looks like in practice. The specific difference between healthy distance and reactive cutoff, how to handle the guilt that inevitably resurfaces even years later, and why some of the most psychologically whole people you will ever meet are the ones who finally, quietly, stopped explaining themselves to people who were never going to understand anyway. So let's walk through what evolved distancing actually looks like in practice, because the difference between this and reactive cutoff isn't about how far apart you live, or how often you talk, or even how the estrangement started. It's about something much more internal, and it shows up in very specific, observable ways. The first difference is in the emotional temperature of the decision. Reactive cutoff is almost always made in a state of high activation, in the middle of a fight, in the aftermath of a specific betrayal, in a moment when the nervous system is flooded and the only thing that feels possible is distance, immediately, completely, right now. And I want to be clear, sometimes that immediate distance is genuinely necessary, especially in situations involving real danger or ongoing abuse. Safety comes first, always, before nuance. But even in those cases, there's a difference between the emergency exit and the long-term relationship to that decision afterward. Evolved distancing over time settles into something calmer. The decision might have started in a moment of crisis, but it stabilizes into something made from clarity rather than adrenaline. A quiet, considered, this is what's right for me, rather than a raw, reactive, I never want to see them again, that's still vibrating with unprocessed rage. The second difference is in how the person talks about the family afterward, and this one is subtle, but incredibly telling. Reactive cutoff tends to produce a flattened narrative. The family becomes uniformly bad. Every memory gets reinterpreted through the lens of harm, and any nuance, any genuinely good moment that existed alongside the difficult ones, gets erased, because right after a rupture, the nervous system needs a simple story to justify the pain of separation. Evolved distancing allows for a much more complicated, more honest narrative to exist. Someone in this place can say something like, "My mother genuinely loved me in the ways she was capable of, and she also caused real damage she never took responsibility for, and both of those things are true, and I don't need to resolve that contradiction in order to know that distance is right for me." That capacity to hold complexity, rather than needing a clean villain, is one of the clearest signs that the grief has actually been metabolized rather than just converted into anger. The third difference, and this is the one that surprises people the most, is in how much energy the person spends explaining their decision to others. Someone in reactive cutoff often spends enormous amounts of energy justifying the estrangement to friends, to extended family, to anyone who questions it, building an airtight case, almost like preparing for a trial, because some part of them is still seeking external validation that the decision was correct. Someone in evolved distancing tends to need this less and less over time, not because they've stopped caring what people think entirely, but because their sense that the decision was right has become internally generated rather than externally dependent. They can say, simply, "We're not close anymore, and that's what's healthiest for me," without following it with 3 paragraphs of evidence, because they no longer need the listener's agreement to feel settled in their own choice. Now let's talk about the guilt, because this is the part almost nobody prepares people for, and it's the part that convinces so many people the distance must have been the wrong decision, when really, it's simply an expected, almost universal part of the process. Here's the truth about guilt in this specific context. It very rarely disappears completely, even years later, even when the decision was unquestionably the right one. And this confuses people enormously, because our culture has taught us that guilt is a reliable moral compass. If you feel guilty, you must have done something wrong. But guilt, in the context of family estrangement, is often not a signal that you made a mistake. It's a signal that you were raised inside a system that trained your nervous system to associate any distance from family, for any reason, with wrongdoing, regardless of whether that distance was actually justified. The guilt isn't evidence against your decision. It's evidence of how deeply the original loyalty programming ran. Understanding this distinction changes everything about how the guilt gets experienced. Instead of treating a wave of guilt as proof you should reconnect, reach out, give it one more try, the way so many people do, cycling in and out of contact for years, each attempt ending in the same disappointment that led to the original distance, evolved. Distancing allows a person to simply notice the guilt, acknowledge where it came from, and let it pass through without acting on it. I feel guilty right now, and I understand exactly why I was taught to feel this way, and I'm still not going to call. That's not coldness. That's the difference between being ruled by a feeling and simply having a feeling. There's also a particular flavor of guilt that deserves special attention, because it's one of the most manipulative and most common experiences people report. The guilt that arrives specifically around holidays, birthdays, family milestones, moments the culture has collectively agreed are supposed to be about family togetherness. This guilt is often amplified not just by internal programming, but by very real, ongoing external pressure. Relatives who reach out specifically during these times, sometimes with genuine longing, sometimes with manipulation disguised as longing, saying things like, "It's the holidays, can't we just put this behind us?" As if the passage of a calendar date should erase a pattern of harm that took years to build. Evolved distancing means learning to recognize this specific pressure for what it is. An attempt to use a shared cultural narrative about family obligation to override your own hard-won clarity about what's actually safe for you. I want to say something important here because this entire conversation could easily be misread as advocating for estrangement as a universal solution, and that is absolutely not what this is about. Not every difficult family relationship requires distance. Many families with genuine effort, honest conversation, and real accountability on both sides repair and even deepen after periods of conflict. The goal was never to convince you that distance is always the answer. The goal is to make sure the choice, whatever it is actually a choice, made from clarity, rather than an obligation you never actually agreed to, inherited before you had any say in the matter at all. And this is really the heart of what makes this kind of distancing an act of evolution rather than an act of avoidance. It requires you to finally separate two things that got fused together so early in your life you probably never noticed they were separate at all: love and obligation. Most people are taught that if you love your family, you owe them access to you, regardless of how that access affects you. Evolved distancing is the realization that love and access are not the same thing, and that you can hold real love, real grief, even real hope for repair, while still, simultaneously, protecting your own nervous system from a dynamic that isn't currently safe for you to be inside of. I want to leave you with an image because I think it captures something about this decision that's very hard to explain directly. Picture a tree planted decades ago, right up against the wall of an old house. So close, in fact, that as both the tree and the house aged, their roots and foundations became genuinely tangled underground, invisible to anyone standing outside. For years, this seemed fine. The tree provided shade. The house provided a windbreak. Nobody looked closely enough to notice that the tree's roots had slowly begun cracking the house's foundation, just as the house's foundation had begun, in turn, restricting how deeply and how freely the tree's roots could actually grow. Removing the tree from beside that house isn't an act of hatred toward the tree. It's not a statement that the tree was worthless, or that the years of shade it provided never mattered. It's simply the recognition, arrived at slowly, carefully, after watching the cracks spread for long enough, that both the tree and the house need room the other one was never going to be able to provide, as long as they stayed tangled together the way they'd always been. And here's the part that matters most. Once that tree is finally moved, replanted somewhere with actual room to grow, roots finally free to spread in directions they were never able to reach before, something remarkable happens that couldn't have happened while it stayed tangled against that same foundation. It grows differently, not because the old house was purely bad or the years beside it were wasted, but because some things, however much history they share, however much good coexisted alongside the damage, were simply never going to be able to become their fullest shape while staying exactly where they'd always been. That's what this evolution actually is, not a rejection of everything that came before. Just finally, enough room to grow into whatever you were always capable of becoming, on your own roots, in your own soil, on ground that was never going to crack beneath you the way the old foundation eventually did.